cut the in our time chapters. Jesus, I feel all shot to hell about it. Of course they can do it because the stuff is so tight and hard, and everything hangs on everything else. So this is the very recognizable posture on the part of Hemingway, that everything is tight and hard and everything hangs on everything else. So, but given the publication history of the various chapters and also the stories published separately, whether or not there is in fact an organic unity among them, that's the big question. And last time, we tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, and we read the inter-chapters and the stories as if they were indeed organically integral to one another. So today we'll try some other combinations. But I found this picture of Hemingway and Dos Passos. So Hemingway is to the far right, and that's Dos Passos to the far left. And I always loved this. And they actually both wrote about war. Dos Passos has a novel called Three Soldiers, very, very great novel about war as well. So you can sort of see that they have a lot in common. Here's another important letter to Edmund Wilson. This is slightly earlier. Finished the book of 14 stories with a chapter in our time between each, to give the picture of the whole between examining it in detail, like looking with your eyes at something, say a passing coastline, and then looking at it with 15x binoculars, or rather maybe looking at it and then going in and living in it, and then coming out and looking at it again. It has a pretty good unity. So once again, that all-important word for Hemingway, pretty good unity, and that's a very strong claim. It's not really pretty good, it's damn good. But in any case, what's new about this description is the idea of zooming in and zooming out, right? So this is very much the approach that we've been taking, and we've been thinking of it in terms of micro and macro, right? So this the first set of terms that we started out with. And today I'd like to add a few more terms that sort of line up in a kind of similar way, obviously not the same, but they're kind of interrelated. So micro, macro, obviously up close from a distance, before and after, and that's especially important when the soldier is coming back home. What happened during the war, what happened after the war, and going along with that intensity of the experience when you're in the war, and as we know from the story Soldiers Home, the staleness of it when you come back. And then another pair of terms very important to our class actually is tragedy and comedy. Since this is a writing class, I also want to stop for just 1 minute and talk about this as a kind of a useful analytic and organizational structure to use in your papers. So start out with one pair of analytic terms and then try out the various variations of that term in the course of the paper. And that will give you a really tight structure. That's what Hemingway wants. So I'll explain this more, but just keep this in your mind. Think of your papers as theme and variation. Inventing different terms that would allow for that theme and variation structure. So I'll talk more about the substantive implication of that. But for now, I think that this is really what Hemingway himself is doing, because such a great writer, is a good example to us. So anyway, today we'll be looking at 4 possible clusters. Want to emphasize that these are just conjectural clusters. We can test them. The first one is chapter 7 and Soldiers Home. And then we'll be looking at chapter 9 and Mr. and Mrs. Elliot, hilarious story. Chapter 10 and Cat in the Rain. And then chapter 12 and Big Two-Hearted River, Part 2. So first, chapter 7. Once again, we're back in wartime Europe. the experience of combat. While the bombardment was knocking the trench to pieces at Fusata, he lay very flat and sweated and prayed, "Oh, Jesus Christ, get me out of here. Dear Jesus, please get me out. Jesus, please, 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 Christ." The shelling moved further up the line. We went to work on the trench, and in the morning, the sun came up, and the day was hot and muggy and cheerful and quiet. The next night, back at Mestra, he did not tell the girl he went upstairs with at the Villa Rosa about Jesus. And he never told anybody. So this is the sort of the classic dynamics of before and after, and the intensity of the experience when you're in the thick of the battle, and the sense that you really have lost it all once that experience is behind you. So what Hemingway is exploring here, and that we'll see he'll also explore at great length in Soldier's Home, is the intransitive relation of emotions across time. It's a terrible thing. We think so much about the question of sustainability. It's important for things to be sustainable across time. And it seems that Hemingway is saying that basically intense emotions are not sustainable across time. And we'll see this in a big way, actually, in Faulkner, in The Sound of Fury, in the Quentin section, whether or not, even when we're devastated by something, whether or not that sense of devastation will be with us even a short moment afterwards. So it seems that when he's fearing, in this kind of mortal fear for his life, Jesus, and that's really a kind of a name for something. It's not necessarily Jesus, although in this case it actually is Jesus, but Jesus could also be a shorthand for something that we really want just to invoke, and it's very much a presence for us at that moment. And then the meaning of Jesus is completely lost, even the next night. What's interesting, and I guess quite bleak about this, is that we really can hold on to our own experience, right? We'd like to think that if we've been through this, that is ours for good, is ours for life, and it seems not to be the case. So let's move on now to Soldier's Home, and we know, I'm just realizing the mic is all the way down. We know that Krebs was a soldier fighting in basically all the famous battles in World War I, and then he comes home too late, so by which time all the other people have been back and they've been telling stories about war atrocities, so nobody's listening to him anymore, and his mother is just worried that he should find a job. So this is the very near the middle, just one line near the middle of the story, having breakfast, Krebs is reading the papers and worrying about his father not wanting the paper to be roughed up. And then meanwhile, Krebs looked at the bacon fat hardening on his plate. And I think that is, in some sense, the most graphic metaphor that Hemingway has come up with, material emblem of our own relation to our own experience, that this is the chemical transformation. It's so natural. Last time we talked about the naturalization of pain, right? Childbirth is as natural as rain, and the pain that we inflict on others is also as natural as rain. And here, for fresh experience to go stale, it is as natural as the bacon becoming stale on your plate. So that's just a kind of a, using a very common object to talk about the fate of emotions across time, and the fact that to go on living is not cumulative. There's a loss until the longer you live. This is a terrible thing. We like to think that some things can, be cumulative, but according to this paradigm, it's almost as if the longer you live, the more you lose, actually. And we know that Hemingway actually chose to end his own life, right? So this is almost a kind of, I mean, he wasn't thinking of suicide at that point, at this early point, but it's almost a justification for suicide, that you want to end it at the moment of its greatest intensity and greatest emotional satisfaction. You don't want to lose that. So there's that, the bacon fat hardening on his plate. And then the very end of the story, well, that was all over now anyway. He would go over to the schoolyard and watch Helen play indoor basketball. No detail is trivial, no detail is random, well, not always, but quite often. I mean, you know, this is a very significant detail in Hemingway. And it is, it's almost the kind of a larger, slightly larger view, moving away from the bacon fat on the plate to the larger family situation. Krebs was a very good soldier during World War I. He's not a very efficient player in civilian life, right? Helen is the player. She's literally the basketball player, but she's also a player in a bigger sense. She's more consequential in life than Krebs ever would be. And it's the sadness of being consequential, being utterly consequential, important, very good at what you're doing in one context, and being terrible, being, you know, not attended to, not listened to, being completely on the sidelines once you're put in a different kind of situation. So Krebs is on the sidelines, a mere spectator, as Helen plays both the indoor basketball and also the game of life that he's probably not going to be very good at. So obviously, I think these two stories, the connection between them, very, very tight. You know, they are in two different settings, but they really are making exactly the same point. So let's move on now to a more interesting kind of not so quite so clear-cut between Chapter 9 and Mr. and Mrs. Elliot. So Chapter 9 is in many ways the kind of the Hemingway that we're very familiar with, the Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, the Hemingway who talks about bullfights. He also does it in Death in the Afternoon. So this is the kind of the classic Hemingway. The first, except there's a twist here. The first matador got the horn through his sword hand, and the crowd hooted him. The second matador slipped, and the bull caught him through the belly. He hung on to the horn with one hand and held the other tight against the place, and the bull rammed him wham against the wall, and the horn came out, and he lay in the sand, and then got up like crazy drunk and tried to slug the man carrying him away, and yelled for his sword, but he fainted. The kid came out and had to kill 5 bulls, because you can't have more than 3 matadors. You know, this is the emotion, I think, that actually is the dominant emotion in our time. This isn't exactly tragedy. It doesn't rise to the level of tragedy, but it's not exactly funny either. And this is really the combination of the tragedy / comedy that is so important to Hemingway. Nobody gets killed except for the bull, 5 of them, but that's supposed to happen. They're 2 completely incompetent matadors. They're making a farce, really, of the bullfight. And meanwhile, it's also farcical in a different way, that you have to stick by the rules. Even though the first two matadors are making a complete mess of everything, you still have to go by the rules. So you can have more than 3 matadors, and so one single person is to kill 5 bulls, because that's the rule. So, you know, this is the kind of the combination we don't know whether to laugh or to cry. I guess we laugh because it's not worth crying over, but it really isn't all that funny. And this is the nature of the kind of very complicated, dark kind of comedy that we get in Hemingway, and that will be getting in Fitzgerald and Faulkner as well. So this is really the common ground. Very interesting compounding of genres. Usually we're used to thinking of tragedy and comedy as two discrete genres, quite separate, right? But in American literature, I mean, this really goes back to the 19th century. In American literature, quite often there's a kind of a mixing of genres with tragedy being energized, actually, by comedy and producing a really interesting kind of experimental genre. So keep that in mind. It's about bullfighting and incompetent matadors, and then the kid having to clean up the mess. So it would seem, on the face of it, it would seem that really couldn't have any relation to Mr. and Mrs. Eliot, which has nothing to do with bullfighting. It's about a poet or someone who's trying to be a poet and his wife and so on. But there's very interesting history behind this story. And Mr. and Mrs. Eliot, with the story, was first published in the Little Review. Last time we talked about how a lot of the pieces came out in little magazines, right? So this is the Little Review 1924-1925 edition. And then it came out again in our time, obviously, the Liver Wright edition, the American edition, 1925. And it turns out that Hemingway actually has written a very telling letter to Horace Liver Wright. You can see it here. I mean, actually, I think that if you go to classes for you to look at the image online, you should be able to zoom in and actually look at all the words. But anyway, this is the transcript of one of the paragraphs. As you will see, I have revised the Mr. and Mrs. Eliot story and entirely eliminated the obscene image. It is a shame. It had to be changed. But as you say, it would be a very silly play to get the entire first book suppressed for the sake of a few funny cracks in one story. James Heath ran it in its original form. This is the Little Review, editor of the Little Review. James Heath ran it in the original form and did not get into any trouble. Okay, so we're talking about a libel suit, it looks like, that legal action could be visited upon Hemingway because of this story. So what could be the cause for this legal action against Hemingway? The title of the story is suggestive, right? You know, Eliot is a kind of very important name in both American literature and British literature. Very, very important name. This is T.S. Eliot, obviously, known to Hemingway. They were in the same circles both in England and also in France. T.S. Eliot, with one of the most important poets, 20th century poets, best known for the poem *The Wasteland*, would go on in 1948 to win the Nobel Prize. So, you know, a major poet. This is a picture of his first wife, Vivian, and Eliot is on the far right, and Vivian is on the far left. And it was a marriage that ended in divorce, and with Vivian having lots of mental problems. So it was a kind of very public dissolution of the marriage, but very painful actually, when she was clearly going crazy. Hemingway's story isn't really about that, but it's really making fun of something that really didn't end up being all that funny. I mean, it was a kind of a horrendous episode in T.S. Eliot's life. But the way that Hemingway is talking about it initially is this. This is his version, and as you'll see, he's actually changed the spelling, right? T.S. Eliot, just one L. And so, you know, just to remove the threat of legal action from himself, he's changed the spelling of Eliot. And this is the story that he tells. Mrs. Eliot and a girlfriend now slept together in the big medieval bed. They had many a good cry together. In the evening, they all sat at dinner together in the garden under a plane tree, and the hot evening wind blew, and Eliot drank white wine, and Mrs. Eliot and the girlfriend made conversation, and they were all quite happy. Once again, this is the happy ending in quotation marks in Hemingway. But you can really see why that Eliot, or at least T.S. Eliot, would contemplate legal action against Hemingway. Obviously, the suggestion of a lesbian relationship, not really, there was nothing actually in the actual life of Vivian Eliot to suggest that there was a lesbian relation. She did have an affair very soon after she was married to T.S. Eliot, but with a man, Bertrand Russell, actually, famous philosopher. There was this is complete fabrication on the part of Hemingway. But I think that there's actually possibly something else that's mixed into this story. It's the lesbian relationship that stops this from being a tragedy, right? It really would have been quite tragic, if the girlfriend had not been there. But it's really this three triangular relation that enables Mr. Eliot to drink white wine and to spend all night writing poetry. He doesn't especially want to be in the same room with his wife. And Mrs. Eliot and the girlfriend have many a good cry together in the big medieval bed. And they were all quite happy. So Hemingway really is in one sense thinking of the historic T.S. Eliot and Vivian Eliot, but I think that he was also actually thinking of another couple, very good friends of his at one point, that he talks about at great length in A Movable Feast. Another iconic figure in American literature, Gertrude Stein, and her companion, lifelong companion, actually, Alice B. Toklas. That's Gertrude Stein on the right and Alice on the left. Hemingway also makes fun of them in A Movable Feast. But if you guys have seen Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, if you haven't seen it, try to see it on DVD. But the Gertrude Stein is very, very important there, as it's really a mentor to Hemingway. I'm sorry, we actually thought of showing this, but it's still running, so we don't have it on DVD to show it. But in any case, if you see that Woody Allen movie, you'll see that Gertrude Stein was crucial both to other young writers, but also to Hemingway. And so a very long-lasting, this is actually a sustainable relationship, the lesbian relationship, for life, really. And happy as much as any relationship can be happy. Those two were very, very happy. So I think that what Hemingway has done actually to produce this tragedy / comedy is to compound the very unhappy T.S. Eliot marriage to Vivian with much happier companionship between Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. He really wasn't thinking of libel from Gertrude Stein. She is not mentioned by name, but she could not have been on his mind. So it's just a really interesting kind of a capsule summary, actually, of a lot of American literature in there. So I think that that's really the connection with chapter 9. Not so much the subject matter, there's no bullfighting in the story, but the kind of the tragedy narrowly averted, turning into a comedy, or kind of a farce, halfway between comedy and farce. That is the ultimate outcome of that kind of unusual arrangement. But still, it doesn't rise to the level of tragedy, and that's the most important point for Hemingway. So let's move on now to the next cluster, and I should stop here for a moment and talk a little bit about the kind of the analytic structure that we'll be using for the next set of stories and chapters. But actually beginning with chapter 9 and Mr. and Mrs. Elliot, we're beginning to see a kind of a logic of substitution, right? So the Gertrude Stein, Alice B. Toklas relationship taking the place, this relatively happy relationship, taking the place of the unhappy historical relation between Vivian and T.S. Eliot, so that Hemingway can get to a place where he wants to be. And so taking the place, substitution, is a good thing in that chapter and in that story. We'll explore the meaning of substitution in the other clusters. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. It's always kind of a mixture. But on the whole, I would say that Hemingway is much more interested in comedy than tragedy. And here I'm sort of going against Aristotle and in fact the whole tradition of Western thinking about genres. Tragedy is the high, dignified, very dignified genre, Greek tragedy. And that's what really Aristotle talks about in the Poetics. His attention is really all given to tragedy. Comedy gets about 2 lines in the Poetics. So, I think that tragedy just has a different kind of centrality to the entire Western canon. But comedy, arguably, is actually just as interesting and just as complex. So in the rest of the course, we'll be thinking about the ways in which comedy actually is right next door to tragedy. We have to rethink the landscape rather than thinking of these two as being on opposite ends of the spectrum, to think about a kind of almost a kind of emotional proximity between tragedy and comedy, not because this is a natural proximity, but because the writers that we're looking at, they tend to have that really kind of interesting kind of thinking and mixing of genres. So in the next cluster, chapter 10 and Cat in the Rain, we'll first of all look at one kind of substitution taking place in chapter 10, the horse and the picador, and then the cat in the rain. I should mention that there's a difference between the picador and the matador. This is a distinction I didn't know about before I started reading about Hemingway. Is that the matador is the one who actually sticks, who actually kills the bull. The picador's function is to weaken the bull. The picador never actually kills the bull, so it's always a kind of a 3-step ceremony. The bull, by the time he comes out, the bull is weakened already by very few sticking knives into him, and the picador tries to do a major job of weakening the bull, and then the matador comes out and actually kills the bull. And the picador doesn't actually come out on foot. He's always on a horse. And this we find out how Hemingway feels about that practice, about the picador coming out on a horse and fighting the bull. They whacked the white horse on the legs, and he kneed himself up. The picador twisted the stirrups straight and pulled and hauled up into the saddle. The horse's entrails hung down in a blue bunch and swung backward and forward as he began to canter, the Marnos whacking him on the back of his legs with the rods. It's a terrible thing. Actually, this has been banned now. It's been banned in many Spanish cities because it's just so incredibly cruel. And here are 2 images of that kind of substitution, shameless use of the horse as a shield against the bull. And we can see the expressions on the, they're used to it. This is done all the time. This is not exceptional cowardice on the part of the picador. That's part of the game. But still, it's very hard to take when you're looking at it, and to see the entrails actually coming out right at that moment. And here's another image. There's just countless images. All you have to do is to type in picador's horse on Google, and you'll find all these images. Hemingway, even though he's a big aficionado of the matador coming out, and we'll see his celebration of this one-on-one battle between the matador and the horse, just finds this practice utterly despicable. I mean, this is really substitution at its worst. And so he's talking about, this kind of it's hard to wrap our minds around, this kind of completely ritualized practice. And so that's what he talks about in chapter 10. And then in Cat in the Rain, once again, there's no thematic continuity, right, between the chapter 10 and Cat in the Rain, about a young American couple in a hotel, completely, non-violent setting, and doesn't seem very dramatic either. In some sense, it seems as if nothing happens in that story. But there is a kind of interesting way in which we can read that story as a story about substitution as well, in the sense that the young wife does have one very emphatic desire. Anyway, I want a cat, she said. I want a cat. I want a cat now. If I can't have long hair or any fun, I can't have a cat. So the cat obviously is a shorthand for something else, right? I mean, she's actually looking at this kitty in the rain, trying to hide from the rain under the table, and thinking of the cat. And she says, okay, if I can't have anything else, I can have my own silver at the table, I can have new clothes, I want a cat. But even those things, eating at a table with my own silver, even that is probably just a metaphor for something else as well. And so the wanting a cat, the fact that it's such an artificial and unpersuasive substitution for something that she doesn't have in her life, suggests that there is something, that this very peaceful story does have something in common with a very violent episode in chapter 9. And it really has to do with the way we think about what is adequate to, what we could call a good life or a good marriage or, good anything. I mean, Hemingway isn't really thinking, especially this story is about, what constitutes a good marriage or what is absent that would make for a bad marriage. But it really is thinking generally and abstractly about what counts as a good life, or what counts as being a good player in a bullfight, and coming out and using your horse as a shield. That doesn't count as merit for Hemingway. So in this case, it's in the wife. If we think about the configuration, she goes out in the rain, an umbrella opens up behind her, and it's a hotel maid that opens up the umbrella behind her. She says, I want a cat, I want a cat. And in fact, I'll just read you the ending of that story. Someone knocked on page 94. Someone knocked at the door. Avanti, George said. He looked up from his book. In the doorway stood the maid. She held a big tortoise-shell cat pressed tight against her and swung down against her body. Excuse me, she said. The padrone asked me to bring this for the signora. First of all, there's kind of a very sly substitution going on, because I don't think it's actually the same cat. This big tortoise-shell cat probably isn't the same Kitty that she saw earlier in the story. So there's one kind of almost comical substitution going on. But the more important substitution in the story, other than just wanting the cat for something else, to stand for something else, is also that instead of the husband being the emotional support for the wife, it is the hotel apparatus that has substituted, has stepped in, and is fulfilling that function. The hotel maid is the one who opens the umbrella when the wife steps out into the rain. She wants a cat. It's the hotel staff that brings the cat. So this is for me, this is one of the best and most memorable portraits of what's missing in a marriage that is just done, in a couple of pages, and done completely through third parties, right? I mean, so this is a story supposedly about husband and wife, and it's almost told completely through third parties, through the cat, through the hotel maid, through the Petrone. And so it says something about Hemingway's strategy as well. And this is really something to think about for all of the writers, is how to frame the story and how to populate the story. And the population of what is in the foreground in the story isn't necessarily the center. I mean, the housemaid is front and center in this story. The story isn't really about the hotel maid, but nonetheless, she is in the foreground, as is the cat. So, what is the story about? This is a good question to ask. Actually, this is another question that is related to writing papers. Start out by thinking, what is this particular paragraph about? I mean, certain things are in the foreground, but it could be that something much more marginal could actually be the real subject of that paragraph. So, it's always a good analytic strategy to think about. Gosh, never thought. Is it mine? It's not mine, right? Yeah. No, for some reason, I just thought, good. That would be really a big embarrassment. But in any case, so well, I mean, here's a little act of substitution, or whatever. But so far, we've been talking about the clustering of the stories in the chapters, really kind of going in a kind of oblique direction, right? It's not this, the lack of emotional satisfaction seems to be the main point in all of the stories. And that's really the kind of the tragedy, comedy / comedy, is the lack of adequate emotional resolution. There's just no emotional resolution at the end of The Cat in the Rain. There's no emotional resolution at the end of Soldiers Home. There's maybe a little bit of emotional resolution at the end of Mr. and Mrs. Elliot, but really not that great. So the question is, is this a kind of a natural resting place for Hemingway? Is that the kind of the emotional landscape that he feels most comfortable with? And that would be completely okay. I think that is a viable way of writing, and you can have great literature resting on precisely that very precarious state of lack of emotional, lack of full satisfaction, lack of full resolution. But I think that Hemingway actually is a slightly different kind of writer. So he is quite unashamed of going to a kind of sometimes almost embarrassing extreme, in the sense that you don't want to show that this is really what you believe in. So it's embarrassing in this sense, but he's not especially embarrassed about making it very clear what he believes in and what he finds satisfying. And I think that that's really what makes Hemingway what he is. It's very, in many ways, a very emphatic about belief and about emotional states that he would affirm and celebrate. So let's look at chapter 12. This is the combination that shows that side of Hemingway. It's not surprising, it's back to bullfighting, but this time it's not the picador on his horse. When he started to kill, it was all in the same rush. The bull looking at him straight in front, hating. The bull charged, and Philotter charged, and just for a moment, they became one. Philotter became one with the bull, and then it was over. Philotter standing straight, and the red hilt of the sword sticking out dully between the bull's shoulders. Philotter, his hand up at the crowd, and the bull rolling blood, looking straight at him, looking straight at Philotter, and his legs caving. So some of us would find it gory. I don't think that I would have been saying the praises of bullfighting, but I think that just to think in terms of what Hemingway is doing, for him, this is a truly sublime and satisfying moment for both the matador and for the bull, because the repeated line is that they became one, right? So they became one. That is the supreme ideal for Hemingway. Instead of having this shield of the horse shielding you from the bull, you are in direct contact with the bull. And whatever you do it in utter lack of distance. So, this is the kind of the close-up, the diminishment of distance. And the two of them really bonding so tightly that it really becomes a kind of a single unit. And that this could be a metaphor for any kind of thing. Can be a man and a bull, can be a man and a woman, can be two women, can be you and the project that you become fused with. But for Hemingway, this kind of complete lack of emotional insulation. We've talked about the question of insulation in Indian camp, but the complete lack of emotional insulation between yourself and something that you feel utterly passionate about. That for Hemingway is the place that he really wants to get to, and all those times when he doesn't get there, you can see that why it's a kind of a frustrating resting place, and he wants us to be frustrated when we can't get beyond those places. So this is a kind of a very the kind of the classic Hemingway moment of epiphany of achieving this union with the thing that the bull that you're going to kill, and the fact that you're going to kill this creature doesn't, according to him, doesn't really matter because you've achieved that union at that critical moment. This is we are not reading The Sun Also Rises, but this is an almost completely parallel moment in The Sun Also Rises. Pedro Romero killing the bull. The bull charged as Romero charged. Romero's left hand dropped the muleta over the bull's muzzle to blind him. His left shoulder went forward between the horns, and the sword went in. And for just an instant, he and the bull were one, right? So you can see that that word "one" is of critical importance to Hemingway. Two entities becoming one, even though at the moment of death and killing, it's still important to achieve that oneness with the world. I'm sure it's romanticizing bullfighting, but it's actually one of the rare public demonstrations of that happening. It's actually very hard. I mean, if we think about this, it's very hard to see two things becoming one in public. So bullfighting is actually one of the rare instances when everyone can be there and watch. Hemingway probably was looking at something like this, and it's really more like a dance than actually the killing of the bull. I mean, you can see why he would want to romanticize something like that, is really completely choreographed in such a way so that the violence becomes completely ritualized, and we almost don't see the blood, and there's no blood in this moment. So anyway, so for Hemingway, completely unembarrassed desire to get to this state here in the ball were one. So let's move on now, and I have to say I've actually liked the Big Two-Hearted River much more than the bullfighting scenes in Hemingway. This is a great story, in many ways, a kind of a rewrite, two-part story, rewrite of Crabbe's coming home, right? So this is also a soldier's home. He's not among his family, but he is on this trip through a country that is not really disclosed to us, a landscape we don't really know where it is. We don't know where he's going or why he's on that trip, but it's a fishing trip. And this is what happens at the moment when Nick catches, and Nick, this is the same Nick that we see grown up, the young Nick in Indian camp in The Doctor's and the Doctor's Wife. Now he's a full-grown man, obviously, and having been in war, but coming back and going through what appears to be a healing process for Hemingway, right? So in Soldier's Home is about the non-healing of Crabbe's, the trauma of war and the trauma of being completely marginal and being sidelined. All of those things will just keep hurting him. In the case of Big Two-Hearted River, it's a rewrite of that, and it's a very different outcome coming out from that story. And it has to do actually with similar dynamics to the bullfighting. So Nick cleaned them, slitting the trout. Nick cleaned them, slitting them from the vent to the tip of the jaw. All the insides and the gills and the tongue came out in one piece. They were both males, long gray-white strips of meal, smooth and clean, all the insides clean and compact, coming out all together. So this is his just as emotionally satisfying as the bullfighting, not in the sense that we don't have the choreographed movement quite as dramatic and beautiful as in the bullfight, but to be able to extend the ritual of dying in one piece to the trout. That is, we do have to kill the trout. I mean, unless we're going to go without any kind of animal protein. So the trout is the kill, but the way, the manner of killing is everything. That there should be no degradation in that. That actually the measure of a good life is first your ability to offer a good death to someone else, right? We do this all the time. It makes all the difference in the world whether we kill brutally or whether we kill ceremoniously with full respect for what we kill. And it also makes all the difference in the world if you die a good death. There's really no other conclusion. So it has to be completely clean and satisfying, and both to the person who's going, or the creature who's going through it, and to the person who's performing that operation. So there's actually, as far as I can see, Hemingway is actually a very affirmative writer at the end of In Our Time, in the sense that he's also revising his own story, right? It's not, he doesn't get to where he wants to be in Crabbe's story, in Soldier's Home. He comes back and tells the story one more time, and this time he gets to where he wants to be. So we'll say goodbye to Hemingway now and move on to Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby.